It all started innocently enough, a weekend road trip. Just 4 friends, an old RV, and miles of open desert. We were looking to get away from the city, the noise, and the stress of our everyday lives. None of us expected anything more than some sunburn, bad campfire stories, and maybe a few laughs about how ill-prepared we were for the desert heat. The drive out was nothing special. The radio cut in and out as we wound our way through the cracked highways, and the only real conversation we had was about how excited we were to escape reality for a few days. We were planning to camp somewhere remote, away from other campers, just the 4 of us and the stars. Mike, my best friend since middle school, had inherited this beat-up RV from his uncle, and he swore it still ran just fine despite looking like it had seen better decades. By the time we pulled off the main road and onto the dusty trail leading into the desert, the sun had already started dipping low, casting everything in that soft orange glow that makes everything feel surreal. Mike drove the RV carefully, trying not to hit too many rocks, while Ellie, his girlfriend, complained about the lack of air conditioning. My girlfriend, Sarah, and I just laughed, mostly excited to finally be away from the world. We set up camp near a small cluster of rocks and made a fire, cracking open a few beers as the night crept in. The air cooled quickly, and the vast desert stretched out in every direction. It was peaceful, until the night started creeping in on us. Mike had gone inside the RV to grab more snacks when we heard him call out, "Guys, you're not gonna believe this." His voice had that excited tone that usually meant he'd found something weird. The 3 of us walked over, curious, and found him standing in front of one of the old wooden panels inside the RV, grinning like a kid on Christmas morning. "Look at this," he said, pointing to the wall. "I was messing with this panel because it was loose, and I found something behind it." In his hand was a crumpled, yellowed piece of paper. It looked old, and there was a drawing of what seemed like the desert. Some landmarks were scrawled in ink, and at the bottom, an X was clearly marked. "It's a treasure map," Mike said, laughing. "Or at least, that's what it looks like." Ellie rolled her eyes. "Yeah, right. It's probably just some prank or part of an old tourist gimmick." "Who hides treasure in the desert?" Sarah shrugged. "I don't know. It does look kind of old. Maybe it's from the guy who owned the RV before Mike's uncle?" I'll admit, I wasn't sold on the idea either. The whole thing felt like one of those ridiculous stories you tell around a campfire, not something that happens in real life. But the desert did strange things to people's minds. The vast emptiness, the silence. It made you feel like anything was possible. After some debate, we decided to follow the map. It was supposed to lead us to something a few miles away, an easy hike, according to Mike. It sounded stupid, but there was something about the idea of finding hidden treasure that made us all giddy, like we were kids again. The next morning, we packed up some water and headed out into the dunes. The sun was high, beating down on us, and we had to stop a few times to make sure we were still on track. The landmarks on the map were vague. Big rock, old tree stump, but we managed to match them to the landscape around us. As we walked, the desert seemed to stretch out endlessly. At first it was fun, but soon the sun and the heat started to wear us down. The sand shifted under our feet, making the walk harder than expected. But we kept going, spurred on by the excitement of the unknown. Then things started to get weird. About an hour in, we heard a faint rustling behind us. It wasn't the wind, it was too rhythmic. At first we thought it was some animal, maybe a snake or a coyote. But when we stopped, the sound stopped too. Mike joked that it was probably the treasure hunter from some old movie, following us to steal the loot at the last minute. We laughed it off, but I noticed that Ellie kept looking over her shoulder, and Sarah was unusually quiet. Another half hour passed, and the sun seemed to shimmer strangely in the distance. At first, I thought it was just a mirage, but then I saw it, a figure, far off in the dunes, walking toward us. I pointed it out to the others, and we all stopped to stare. "It's probably just some other hikers," Mike said, though his voice lacked conviction. There was no one else out here, not for miles. We hadn't seen another car or person since we left the main road. The figure didn't seem to get any closer. It was just there, a vague shadow moving with the shifting sands. "Let's keep going," Sarah said softly, her eyes wide. "I don't like this." We pressed on, following the map until we reached a small outcropping of rocks that looked like the X marked on the map. It was strange, but in that moment, none of us wanted to talk about the figure in the distance. It felt like if we didn't acknowledge it, it wasn't real. Mike started digging, laughing about how we were going to be rich. But all I could think about was that sound from earlier, and the figure I swore I still saw out of the corner of my eye. After what felt like forever, Mike hit something hard. We gathered around as he pulled out a small dusty box. It wasn't gold or jewels like we'd hoped, just an old stone tablet with some carvings on it. Ellie groaned. Seriously? All this for a rock? But Sarah knelt down, brushing the sand off the stone. Look, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. It's writing. The tablet had a simple message etched into it. Friendship is the true treasure. Mike chuckled. But it was hollow. We all felt it. The unease that had been building since we found that map. The message was innocent enough, but there was something off about the whole situation. Suddenly, the air around us felt heavy, like the desert itself was watching. We all stood there in silence, unsure of what to do next. The figure was gone, but the feeling of being followed wasn't. Let's get out of here, I muttered, and no one argued. We started back toward the RV, but the walk felt longer, the sand shifting more aggressively under our feet. Every now and then, I swore I heard that rustling again, but when I turned around, there was nothing but the endless dunes. When we finally made it back to the campsite, we were exhausted. Mike tossed the stone tablet into the RV and muttered something about it being a waste of time. But none of us could shake the feeling that something was wrong. That night, as we sat around the fire, no one spoke. The silence was thick, only broken by the occasional crackle of the flames. And then we heard it, the rustling again, just beyond the circle of light cast by the fire. This time, we didn't laugh it off. We all sat there, frozen, listening as the sound moved closer. It was slow, deliberate, like something was circling us, just out of sight. Do you hear that? Ellie whispered, her voice trembling. Before any of us could respond, the sound stopped. The desert was still, but it wasn't peaceful. It felt like we were being watched, like something was out there, waiting. We never figured out what it was. We packed up the next morning and drove back to the city in silence. No one mentioned the figure, or the rustling, or the strange feeling that had settled over us like a thick fog. But even now, I can't stop thinking about it. About the map, the tablet, the figure in the distance. Was it all just some elaborate prank? A trick of the desert heat? Or was there something more, something we weren't supposed to find? I don't know. And honestly, I'm not sure I want to. But sometimes late at night when I'm alone, I think I hear it again. That faint rustling just outside my window, and I wonder if maybe it followed us back. If that gave you chills, the next story will leave you frozen in fear. I've always loved camping, just the quiet, the fresh air, and the escape from the hustle of city life. I'm not a hardcore backpacker or anything like that. My idea of roughing it is parking my RV somewhere secluded and reading a book by the fire. It's peaceful, you know? It's like pressing pause on the rest of the world. So, when I found the little campground by Stillwater Lake, I knew it was the perfect spot. It was one of those lesser-known places. No fancy trails, no families with screaming kids, just nature. The water was calm, the trees were tall and thick, and the only sounds were the occasional bird chirping or the rustle of the wind in the leaves. I set up camp, got my fire going, and settled in for a few days of complete relaxation. The first day was perfect. I made a cup of coffee, sat by the water, and watched the sun dip behind the trees. That night, I slept like a rock. No traffic noise, no phones ringing, just silence. But the next morning, I noticed something odd. My right shoe was missing. At first, I thought I'd just misplaced it. Maybe I'd kicked it under the RV while I was setting up the night before. But after a solid 20 minutes of searching, I came up with nothing. I was a little irritated, but I had a spare pair, so I brushed it off. Must have been raccoons, I muttered to myself. I'd seen them out here before, nosing around for food scraps. Annoying, but harmless. I went about my day, hiking a bit, reading, and just enjoying the peace. But that night, I made sure to stow everything away. I didn't want any more surprise thefts. The next morning, though, it happened again. This time, my lantern was gone. And I'm talking about a big camping lantern. The kind you don't just overlook. I had it hanging on the hook right next to my RV door, and now it was gone. No trace of it anywhere. I checked the area, even wandered into the woods a bit, hoping maybe it got knocked over by the wind. But nothing, not even a clue. Now, I was starting to get creeped out. Shoes were one thing, light enough for a raccoon or squirrel to carry off. But a lantern? It didn't add up. I kept telling myself it was an animal, but the logical part of my brain was starting to question it. Raccoons don't usually go for things like lanterns, do they? The next night, I made sure to secure everything. I put all my stuff inside the RV. I locked the door. I even propped a chair up against the entrance, like I was trying to keep out an intruder. I laughed at myself a little for being so paranoid, but something didn't feel right. I couldn't shake the unease that had settled into my gut. Around midnight, I woke up to a strange sound. It was subtle, but enough to pull me from sleep. It sounded like scratching, soft but insistent. I lay there, my heart pounding in my chest, straining to listen. The scratching grew louder, like something was trying to get in. My first thought was raccoons again, but this was different. It sounded too deliberate, too human. I grabbed a flashlight and crept towards the door, every creak of the floor making my skin crawl. The scratching had stopped by the time I reached the door, but now my mind was racing. I flicked on the light and shone it through the small window. Nothing. Just the dark trees swaying in the breeze. I opened the door slowly, shining the flashlight in every direction. Nothing seemed out of place. I stepped out, the cool night air biting at my skin, and scanned the area. Still nothing. But as I turned to go back inside, something caught my eye. On the ground, right by the base of the RV, was my missing lantern. I stared at it for a long moment, my brain trying to make sense of it. How had it gotten there? I hadn't left it out, I was sure of that. And even if I had, how did it disappear for a day and then just show up like this? I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I was determined to get to the bottom of things. I set up a small camera outside the RV, aimed at the area where the lantern had reappeared. I figured if it was an animal, I'd catch it in the act, and at least I'd have an explanation. That night, I kept the camera rolling, though I didn't sleep much. Every little sound made me jump. I was convinced something was out there, watching, waiting. When I checked the footage the next morning, I wasn't prepared for what I saw. At first, it was just the usual stuff. Leaves blowing, a squirrel darting by, nothing out of the ordinary. But then, around 2 a.m., something moved in the shadows. It was small, but not small enough to be a raccoon. I squinted, leaning closer to the screen, trying to make sense of it. And then I saw it. A raccoon, wearing a tiny red bandana. I blinked, thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me. But there it was, clear as day. The raccoon skittered up to my RV, looked around, and then darted off into the woods with one of my shoes in its mouth. I sat back, stunned, watching as the mischievous little bandit disappeared into the trees. I couldn't help but laugh. After all the tension and paranoia, it turned out I'd been outsmarted by a raccoon with a flair for fashion. I spent the rest of the day searching the woods and eventually found its little hideout, a pile of my stuff neatly tucked away in a hollow tree. Over the next few days, I actually started to look forward to my visits from the bandit. I even left out snacks for him, and each morning I'd find something new missing. Always returned the next day, of course. We had an unspoken agreement. He could take whatever he wanted, as long as he brought it back. Eventually, it was time for me to leave Stillwater Lake, but I'll never forget my little friend. I've camped at a lot of places, but none quite like that one. And who knows, maybe one day I'll come back to visit the bandit again. Just when you thought it couldn't get worse, it does. Here's what comes next. I don't really believe in ghosts or anything like that, but what happened to us last summer up in the mountains, I still can't explain it. It started as a normal family trip. My wife Sarah and I had taken our 2 kids, Lily, who's 9, and Josh, who's 6, up to the mountains for a camping weekend. We'd rented an RV, a nice little home on wheels to escape the city for a few days. Nothing fancy, just a break from the noise, a chance to get some fresh air and relax under the stars. We arrived at the campground late in the afternoon. It wasn't one of those crowded spots with tons of families. This one was more secluded, tucked away on a foggy mountain peak. There were only a few other campers, and the place had this eerie stillness to it. The fog was rolling in, thick and white, making it feel like we were in a cloud. But I shrugged it off. We were miles away from civilization after all. What else was there to expect? The first night started off great. We set up our spot, roasted marshmallows over a fire, and told stories with the kids. It was peaceful, quiet, but as the night deepened, that fog got heavier, creeping closer and closer, like it was wrapping around us. I noticed the temperature had dropped too, more than I thought it would for a summer evening. Sarah and the kids eventually went inside the RV to sleep. I stayed out a bit longer, finishing my beer, staring into the fog that now seemed to swallow the world around me. It was so thick I could barely see past the fire's edge. That's when it started, the small, unsettling thing. I heard a faint knock. It was soft, barely noticeable, like someone tapping lightly on wood. I figured it was just a branch or an animal. But then it happened again. Knock, knock, knock. I stood up and looked around. The fog was so thick I couldn't see much, but the firelight flickered in front of me. Probably nothing, I muttered to myself, shaking it off. I headed inside the RV, locked the door behind me, and settled into bed next to Sarah. It was around midnight when the radio turned on by itself. I woke up to the sound of static filling the small space. At first I thought I had accidentally left it on, but I distinctly remember turning it off when we got here. The volume was low, but it was there. Just a steady hum of static coming from the old RV radio. I sat up, groggy, and went over to turn it off. As soon as my hand reached for the dial, the static suddenly cut out. Nothing but silence. I turned the knob just to make sure it was off and crawled back into bed. Not long after that, I heard footsteps outside. Now here's the thing. Our campsite was completely isolated. No one was camped anywhere near us. These weren't the footsteps of some animal either. They were slow, deliberate, like someone was walking around the RV. I lay there, frozen, listening. Step, step, step. It circled the RV, once, twice. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. Sarah stirred beside me, but she didn't wake up. I wanted to go out there to check if someone was messing with us, but something held me back. I didn't want to wake the kids, and honestly, I didn't want to admit it, but I was scared. Finally, the footsteps stopped, and the night returned to its unnatural silence. The next morning, I didn't mention anything to Sarah. She seemed well rested. The kids were their usual selves, and I didn't want to worry anyone over what was probably nothing. But something about that fog, the way it clung to everything, had me on edge. And I wasn't alone. Sarah commented on how strange the air felt, like there was a charge to it. The kids complained that their toys kept going missing, only to show up in places we hadn't left them. Little things started happening, things I could almost explain away, but not quite. The fog never lifted, and every evening it grew thicker, almost unnaturally so. The radio continued to switch itself on at random times, always static, never a station. By the third night, I was on edge. That evening, as we sat around the campfire again, the fog rolled in earlier than usual. The sun was still setting, but the fog swallowed its light, making it feel like night had come early. Lily tugged on my sleeve and pointed into the distance. "Dad, who's that?" I followed her gaze. At first, I couldn't see anything through the fog, but then I noticed a figure, barely visible, standing just at the edge of our campsite. It was hard to make out any details, but it looked like a man, dressed in dark clothes, just standing there, watching us. I stood up quickly, my heart pounding. "Hey," I called out. No response. I grabbed the flashlight from beside me and shined it toward the figure. But by the time the beam reached the spot, the man was gone, disappeared. Just like that. My blood ran cold. "Probably just another camper," Sarah said, but I could tell by the look on her face that she didn't believe it either. We hadn't seen anyone else for days, and even if it was someone, why hadn't they said anything? That night, the footsteps came back. I heard them again, this time louder, heavier, and closer. They weren't circling the RV this time. They were right outside the door. I lay there, paralyzed, listening to those slow, deliberate steps. Step, step, step. They stopped, just outside, and then the knocking started again. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. Knock, knock, knock. I sat up, heart racing, and peeked out the window. The fog was so thick I could barely see anything, but there was no one there. My hands were shaking as I reached for the door handle. I had to see. I had to know. I flung the door open, and there, standing just a few feet away in the thick fog, was an old man. He looked to be in his 60s, maybe older, with a long, scruffy beard and wild eyes. He was wearing what looked like an old, tattered ranger uniform, like something from decades ago. "Sorry to bother you folks," he said, his voice raspy, like he hadn't spoken to anyone in years. "Didn't mean to scare you." I was speechless. Who are you?" He smiled, revealing yellowed teeth. "Just the mountain guide. I like to check on campers, make sure they're doing all right." I couldn't tell if he was joking or serious, but there was something off about him, something unsettling. Sarah joined me at the door, her face pale. The kids were still asleep, thank God. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Oh, everything's just fine," the old man said with a chuckle. "Just fine. You folks enjoy your stay." And with that, he turned and disappeared into the fog, his footsteps fading into the distance. We didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, we decided it was time to pack up and leave. The fog hadn't lifted, and the strange occurrences were too much. As we were loading the RV, one of the other campers, a woman in her 40s, came over to us. "You guys leaving already?" she asked. "Yeah," I said, forcing a smile. "Just ready to get back to normal life." She nodded, looking around at the fog. "This place has a way of getting under your skin, doesn't it?" "Do you know anything about an old mountain guide?" I asked, trying to sound casual. The woman looked confused. "Mountain guide? There hasn't been a ranger here in years. The last one died ages ago." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Are you sure?" "Positive," she said. "I've been coming here for 10 years, never seen anyone like that." We drove away from that mountain as fast as we could. To this day, I don't know who or what that old man was. Maybe he was just some eccentric guy playing a prank, or maybe there was something more to it. But every now and then, when the fog rolls in thick around our house, I can still hear those footsteps. Knock, knock, knock. You think that was bad? The next tale is even more unsettling. It started out as a trip we had planned for months. A simple weekend getaway with my closest friends, and the idea seemed perfect. 4 of us, an RV, and a breathtaking view of the ocean. A place where the world would slow down, where we could leave behind the daily grind, breathe in the salty air, and laugh around a campfire like we hadn't done in years. There was me, Danny, always the organizer. My best friend, Mike, the guy who could fix anything that broke. Jen, his girlfriend, the smart, grounded one. And Sarah. Well, Sarah had been my crush since middle school, and though we never made it official, everyone knew I had feelings for her. She had this laugh that could light up any room, no matter how dark it got. We decided to head out to a spot I'd found online, a cliffside overlooking the ocean, not far from a small coastal town. It was supposed to be secluded but not too remote, with a clear view of the horizon where the sun would set every evening. The kind of place people write postcards about. The drive was smooth, music blasting, everyone talking over each other, excited to be away from everything. We reached the spot just before dusk, the sky burning orange and purple as the sun dipped toward the water. There was no one else in sight, just the 4 of us, the ocean, and a thin strip of road that led up to the cliff. Below, waves crashed violently against the rocks, but from up top, it all seemed peaceful. We set up camp. Jen and Sarah pulled out snacks while Mike and I made sure the RV was in the right spot, facing the ocean. It was all pretty normal, almost too normal. Looking back, I wish I'd noticed the subtle things, like how the wind had picked up slightly, or how the sky seemed darker than usual, even before the sun was gone. After dinner, we sat around a makeshift fire, roasting marshmallows and telling old stories, the kind of dumb stuff we did as kids. It felt like we had all the time in the world, and then the wind started to howl. At first, it was just a breeze, barely noticeable. But then it got stronger, shaking the branches of the few scraggly trees around us. The fire flickered, and Mike joked about it being the calm before the storm. It wasn't really a joke, though. A few minutes later, the first raindrops hit. They came fast and heavy, drenching the fire and turning the dirt into thick mud. We scrambled to get inside the RV, laughing like idiots as we fumbled with the door. Once inside, Mike grabbed a towel and threw it over his head, acting like a ghost. "Ooh, spooky RV in the middle of nowhere," he teased, wiggling his fingers at us. "Shut up, Mike," Jen said, rolling her eyes. "It's just rain." But the rain wasn't just rain. It pounded on the roof like 1,000 hammers, and the wind, it didn't just howl anymore, it screamed. The whole RV started shaking, and for the first time I felt a twinge of real fear. I glanced out the window, hoping to see, I don't know, something, but all I could see was blackness. The ocean was invisible now, and the sky, covered by thick clouds, gave no hint of stars or moonlight. We were completely cut off. "We should move the RV," Sarah said, her voice barely audible over the storm. "What if the wind pushes us off the cliff?" Mike scoffed. "These things are built for worse. We'll be fine. It's just a storm." But even he didn't sound as confident as he usually did. The RV rattled harder with each gust, and for a second I swore I heard something else, like footsteps, but not quite. More like scraping. I looked around, waiting for one of the others to say something, but no one else seemed to notice. We huddled around the small table, playing cards to distract ourselves from the growing storm outside. Jen brought out the flashlight, pointing it at her face like we were kids again, telling ghost stories. I could see the anxiety creeping into her eyes, though. Sarah sat next to me, her leg brushing mine under the table. For a moment it calmed me, but the wind kept reminding me we weren't safe. The hours crawled by. The rain pounded harder, the RV shaking more violently. And then, without warning, everything stopped. The rain, the wind, the noise, complete silence. For a second I thought maybe the storm had passed, but then I saw the look on Sarah's face, her wide eyes locked on the window behind me. "Danny," she whispered, barely moving her lips. "Look." I turned, slowly, my heart pounding. At first I didn't see anything, just the rain-streaked window, the darkness outside. But then, there it was, a figure, standing, just beyond the RV, near the edge of the cliff. It wasn't moving. It just stood there, facing us. Or at least I thought it was facing us. I couldn't make out any details, just the outline of a person shrouded in the night. "Who the hell is that?" Mike muttered, squinting to get a better look. "No one should be out here," Jen whispered, her voice trembling. "Maybe it's someone from town, checking if we're okay," Sarah suggested, though she didn't sound convinced. We sat there, frozen, staring at the figure. No one moved. No one spoke. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. 1 second it was there, and the next, nothing. The empty blackness returned, as if the figure had never been there at all. "Did you see that?" I asked, my voice cracking slightly. "It just disappeared." Mike shook his head. "Probably just the rain messing with our eyes. You know how weird things look in storms." But none of us were buying it. We all saw it, and it didn't just disappear. It vanished. We locked the doors, just in case, and spent the rest of the night wide awake, listening for anything, any sound that might give us a clue as to what we saw. But there was nothing. No wind, no rain. Just silence, stretching out into the early hours of the morning. When the first light of dawn finally broke, we packed up, eager to leave that place. As we drove down the narrow road, I glanced back at the cliff. The waves crashed against the rocks below, and for a moment, I thought I saw something, a figure standing on the edge, watching us leave. But when I blinked, it was gone. We never spoke about that night again. Not really. Mike would brush it off as a trick of the storm, Jen would roll her eyes, and Sarah, she stopped coming on our trips after that. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe we were just tired and the storm played tricks on us. But deep down, I know what we saw, and I'll never go back to that cliff again. Because whatever it was, it's still out there. Waiting, watching. If that left you uneasy, brace yourself. This next story is far more disturbing. It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend. Just me, my girlfriend Emily, and our friends Matt and Sarah. We'd all been talking for weeks about getting away from the city, ditching our phones, and enjoying some fresh air out in nature. Nothing crazy, just a weekend in a cabin we'd rented online, tucked away in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by towering pine trees. It sounded perfect. The drive to the cabin was peaceful. We had the windows down, music playing softly, and the smell of the trees filling the car. It was late autumn, so the air had that crisp, earthy scent that made you feel alive. The further we drove into the woods, the quieter it got. No cars, no city noise, just the sound of our tires crunching over gravel and the occasional bird chirping. We arrived at the cabin just before dusk. It was exactly how it looked in the photos, small but cozy, with a wooden porch and a view of the dense forest that stretched out endlessly in every direction. The nearest town was a good 30-minute drive away, so we felt like we had the whole world to ourselves. We unpacked, made a quick dinner, and then settled around the fire pit in the yard, drinking beer and roasting marshmallows. Everything felt perfect. Too perfect, maybe. As the sun disappeared behind the trees and the forest grew darker, we started hearing noises. At first it was nothing out of the ordinary, just the sound of the wind rustling through the branches, the occasional hoot of an owl, or the distant rustle of leaves as some small animal scurried by. But then there was something else, a deep, guttural growl that seemed to come from the woods behind the cabin. We all froze for a second. Emily shot me a look, her eyebrows raised, and Matt chuckled nervously. "Did you guys hear that?" he asked, leaning forward in his chair. "Probably just a bear," Sarah said, but her voice wavered a little. She glanced over her shoulder toward the trees, which now seemed a lot more menacing in the dark. "Yeah, a bear," I agreed, trying to sound casual. "This is bear country after all. Maybe we should head inside, though, just in case." Emily laughed, but it was more of a nervous laugh than a real one. "Come on, don't tell me you're scared already. We just got here." But she stood up anyway, brushing off her jeans. "Let's just go inside for the night. No reason to risk it." We all agreed, packing up our stuff and heading back into the cabin. Matt locked the door behind us, and we all settled into the small living room. We tried to relax, but something felt off. You know how sometimes you just know you're being watched, even if you can't see anything? It was like that. I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was out there in the woods, just beyond the trees, watching us. The night dragged on. We played cards, told stories, and tried to laugh off the weird feeling that had settled over us. But every now and then we'd hear something, another growl, a twig snapping, or what sounded like heavy footsteps crunching through the underbrush. It was hard to tell if it was real or just our imaginations playing tricks on us. At some point, we all went to bed, but none of us slept well. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, listening. Every little sound from outside made my heart race. The wind, the trees creaking, and every now and then, that growl again. Morning finally came, and we all woke up bleary-eyed and tense. Over breakfast, we tried to laugh it off. "So, what do you think it was last night? Bigfoot?" Matt joked, but none of us really laughed. "Maybe we should just explore a little today, you know? Check out the area around the cabin," Emily suggested. She was trying to sound upbeat, but I could tell she was as creeped out as the rest of us. We spent the day hiking around the forest, trying to enjoy the beauty of it all, but there was always that nagging feeling that we weren't alone. The trees seemed too quiet, like they were hiding something, and every now and then we'd hear that same growl or the sound of branches snapping in the distance. We never saw anything, though, no matter how hard we looked. That night, things got worse. The noises started again as soon as the sun went down. The growls were louder this time, and we could hear the distinct sound of someone, moving through the trees. It was slow at first, like they were trying to be quiet, but then there was a crash. A loud, unmistakable snap of a tree branch right outside the cabin. We all jumped up, hearts pounding. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered, her face pale. "Yeah," I said, grabbing the flashlight. "I'm going to check it out." Matt stood up too, grabbing a heavy stick from the fireplace. "I'm coming with you." We stepped outside, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The night was still, the air cold against our skin. But there was something there. We could feel it. Something just beyond the trees. "Who's out there?" Matt shouted into the woods, his voice shaky but loud. No answer, just silence. Then, more footsteps, heavy, deliberate. Suddenly a figure stepped out from behind the trees. We both froze, and my heart nearly stopped. But it wasn't some monster or creature from the woods. It was a man, a regular guy, wearing a thick jacket and carrying what looked like a camera. "What the hell are you doing here?" Matt yelled, stepping forward aggressively. The man raised his hands, looking just as startled as we were. Whoa, easy. I'm with a research group. We're studying the local wildlife, bears mostly. Didn't mean to scare you." I lowered the flashlight, feeling a rush of relief but also confusion. "What? You've been out here this whole time?" He nodded, looking sheepish. "Yeah, sorry about that. We were tracking some bears last night and got a little too close to your cabin. Didn't realize we were freaking you out. My bad. Matt and I looked at each other and then back at the guy. So, all those noises, the growls and the footsteps, that was you? Not exactly, the man said, scratching the back of his head. Some of it, yeah. But the growls, those were definitely bears. They're pretty active this time of year. We stood there for a moment, processing everything. It made sense, but at the same time, something still felt off. Maybe it was just the adrenaline from the night before, or maybe it was the way the man seemed a little too calm about everything, but we let it go. The next morning, the man and his research team invited us to join them on a wildlife tour, and we ended up spending the day learning about the local bears and the work they were doing. It was fascinating, and by the end of it, we all felt a lot better. But as we packed up to leave that afternoon, I couldn't help but glance back at the woods one last time. There was still that nagging feeling in the back of my mind, that lingering sense that something else had been out there, watching us. Something we couldn't explain. We never did figure out what it was. That was just the beginning. The next story will truly haunt your thoughts. It was supposed to be an ordinary family camping trip. We were all looking forward to it. Just me, my wife Sarah, and our 2 kids, Hannah and Ben. I'd been to a few of these rugged campgrounds in my day, but we hadn't taken the kids on a proper wilderness trip yet. We figured it was time for a bit of an adventure, something that wasn't just the usual lake day or park picnic. The canyon trail wasn't far from home, and we thought it would be nice to disconnect for a while. That's the thing, though. You never really know what you're getting into when you head out into the wild. I wasn't thinking much about that when I packed the car early that Saturday morning. Just loaded it up with camping gear, food, flashlights, and the usual stuff you need for a couple of nights under the stars. The drive was supposed to be simple too, an easy few hours through winding roads, and we'd be there by late afternoon. We'd set up camp, roast marshmallows, and share stories by the fire. That's all we were expecting. We didn't know then how much things could change in just a few hours. The first sign of things getting off track was the weather. It wasn't bad, no storms or anything, but the sky started to get this weird gray tint to it. It wasn't cloudy, but more like the sun had dimmed somehow. I shrugged it off at first, telling myself it was just the canyon walls casting a shadow or something. We kept driving, the kids were laughing in the back seat, and Sarah was fiddling with the radio, trying to get a signal out here. And that's when we saw him. At first, I thought it was a rock or a log on the side of the road, but as we got closer, it became clear. It was a man, a lone hiker, sitting on a boulder, his backpack resting beside him. He waved as we approached, and I slowed down instinctively. "Should we stop?" Sarah asked, glancing at me. I hesitated for a second. I mean, it wasn't every day you come across someone stranded in the middle of a canyon, but he didn't look dangerous. He had on a flannel shirt and a wide-brimmed hat, the kind you'd see in one of those outdoors magazines. He seemed normal enough. "Yeah, let's see if he's okay," I said, pulling the car over. I rolled down the window as we stopped beside him. "Need a hand?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. The man smiled, standing up and brushing off his pants. "Hey there, I'm so glad you stopped. My name's Alan. I think I got a little turned around out here. I've been hiking for a couple of days and lost track of where the trail led back to the campground." He didn't seem out of breath or anything, just a little dusty and tired. Sarah gave me a look, and I could tell she was thinking the same thing I was. If we didn't help him, who would? It wasn't like there were a lot of cars passing through here. "Do you need a ride somewhere?" I asked, gesturing to the back seat. "We're headed to the campground ourselves." Alan's face lit up. "That'd be amazing. I thought I'd have to sleep under a rock tonight if I didn't find my way back soon." I nodded and unlocked the doors. The kids scooted over to make room, and soon enough, Alan was in the back seat with them, chatting like we were all old friends. He had a way with words, funny stories about his hiking adventures, odd encounters with wildlife, even some tips on camping that I hadn't heard before. He seemed harmless enough, even charming, but something about him, it didn't sit right with me. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. It was the little things, really. The way he kept avoiding direct questions, changing the subject whenever we asked him too much about himself. At first, I thought he was just one of those types, a drifter with more stories than facts. But the more he talked, the more I noticed these strange inconsistencies. He said he'd been hiking the canyon for days, but he didn't have much gear, just that small backpack. And the more he described his journey, the less sense it made. Trails that didn't exist, places I knew weren't part of the route. As we pulled into the campground, my unease grew. But it was getting dark, and we figured it was best to set up camp before worrying too much about our mysterious guest. Alan offered to help, of course. He was friendly, upbeat, the kind of guy who acted like he belonged everywhere, but it was strange how quickly he made himself at home with us. That night, as we sat around the fire roasting marshmallows, he told us one last story. It was about a place he had camped at years ago, where he had met a strange couple in the middle of nowhere. They seemed nice at first, just like we had, but as the night went on, things got unsettling. The couple began acting erratically, whispering to each other in a language Alan didn't understand. Then, just before dawn, they vanished, leaving behind only a small trinket Alan still carried with him, a silver medallion he pulled from his pocket and showed to us with a grin. The story should have been nothing more than a spooky campfire tale, but there was something about the way Alan told it that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. As the night wore on, I noticed the kids were quieter than usual, and even Sarah seemed more tense. Maybe it was the firelight playing tricks, but Alan's smile seemed off. Too wide, too knowing. I didn't say anything, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Around midnight, we all turned in. Alan set up his tent nearby, and I tried to fall asleep, but I kept waking up to small noises outside. Footsteps, breathing, whispers. Each time I told myself it was just the wind or some animal, but deep down, I knew I wasn't the only one awake. The next morning, I woke to find Alan already packing up his things. He was cheerful as ever, thanking us for our hospitality. Before he left, though, he handed me a folded piece of paper. "I write for a travel magazine," he said with a wink. "You'll be featured in my next article. It's about the kindness of strangers." And then he was gone, walking off into the canyon as casually as he had appeared. Weeks later, I searched for his article, just out of curiosity, but there was nothing. No mention of Alan, no story, no magazine. Just an empty space where his name should have been. I still don't know who he really was. But sometimes, when I close my eyes at night, I swear I can still hear him, whispering just outside the tent. Scared? You should be. Because what comes next is even darker. It all started as a normal, much-needed break. Emma and I had been planning this trip for months, a chance to finally get away from the chaos of everyday life. I'm talking about the kind of stress that makes you feel like you're suffocating in your own skin. So, when we finally pulled our RV into the campground, nestled deep in the heart of a national park, it felt like we could breathe again. It was mid-July, but there was a light breeze that rustled through the towering pines surrounding us, their shadows dancing across the ground. Families were laughing in the distance, kids playing, and the air was filled with the comforting smell of campfires. It was just the kind of place we needed. Quiet, peaceful, and of course, we had Mr. Whiskers with us, our orange tabby. He hated car rides but loved the outdoors, and we thought bringing him along would make the trip even better. We parked the RV, set up camp, and let him roam a little, keeping a close eye. Everything was normal until it wasn't. That first night as we sat by the fire, something strange happened. I heard a faint noise just outside the flickering circle of firelight. It was soft, like a whisper or a light shuffle in the leaves. Emma didn't seem to notice, too focused on roasting marshmallows. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or some other harmless critter. I brushed it off, but the noise came again. This time, it was closer. My stomach tightened, a subtle unease creeping up my spine. I glanced around the campsite, scanning the darkness, but nothing seemed out of place. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was there, watching us. "Did you hear that?" I finally asked, trying to sound casual, not wanting to spook Emma. "Hear what?" she replied, looking up at me with a smile, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the fire. "I don't know. Probably nothing," I muttered, forcing a chuckle. But I couldn't ignore it. The night felt different after that, as if the comforting silence of the forest had shifted into something more sinister. I tried to tell myself I was being paranoid, but that feeling of being watched lingered. We decided to head to bed shortly after. Emma climbed into the RV and I followed, calling Mr. Whiskers in from where he'd been playing under a nearby tree. But when I looked for him, he was gone. I wasn't too worried at first. Cats like to wander, especially Mr. Whiskers. But as I called out his name into the night, there was no response. Not even a rustle in the bushes. Just silence. "Did you see him come inside?" I asked Emma, my voice a little more tense than I wanted it to be. She shook her head. "He was right there a few minutes ago." We spent the next hour walking the campground, calling for him, checking under cars and bushes, but he was nowhere to be found. It wasn't until Emma suggested we check again in the morning that I reluctantly agreed to go to bed. But sleep didn't come easily. Every little sound outside the RV made me jump. The wind howling through the trees, the creak of the RV settling in the dirt, it all seemed magnified, like the world outside was pressing in on us. I kept thinking about that noise I'd heard earlier, the one I'd tried to dismiss. Was it connected? Was something, out there? Around 3 a.m., just when I was finally drifting off, I heard it again. That faint shuffling sound. This time, it was closer. Right outside the RV door. I sat up, my heart pounding, listening intently. There it was again, a slow, deliberate scratching. My mind raced. An animal? Maybe Mr. Whiskers had finally come back. I swung my legs out of bed, tiptoeing to the door. I didn't want to wake Emma. With my hand on the doorknob, I hesitated for a second. Something inside me screamed not to open it, that something was wrong. But I did it anyway. The door creaked open, and the cold night air hit me. I peered out into the darkness, my breath catching in my throat. No one, nothing. But then I saw it. Something lying on the ground just a few feet away. My heart dropped into my stomach. It was a sock, one of Emma's, dirty and crumpled, lying in the dirt like it had been dragged there. Before I could process it, a flicker of movement caught my eye. Just beyond the trees, barely visible in the dim moonlight, a shadow darted through the woods. I froze, my skin crawling. It was too fast to be an animal and too small to be a person. But whatever it was gone before I could make sense of it. I stepped back inside and locked the door behind me, my hands trembling. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I told Emma about the sock. She brushed it off, saying it must have blown off the clothesline the day before. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Mr. Whiskers was still missing, and the strange events from the night before had me on edge. We spent the next day searching for him, asking other campers if they'd seen our cat. A few people had noticed him prowling around the night before, but no one had seen him since. One man, an older guy with a grizzled beard, mentioned hearing strange noises near his campsite, like footsteps in the woods. He laughed it off, saying it was probably just a raccoon. But the look in his eyes told me he wasn't so sure. By the second night, my nerves were frayed. The campsite that had once felt so peaceful now felt oppressive, like the trees were closing in on us. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. As we sat by the fire, the noises started again. This time they were louder, more distinct. Footsteps crunching in the underbrush circling our campsite. I stood up, my heart racing. "Did you hear that?" I whispered to Emma, who was staring into the fire, her face pale. She nodded slowly. "I thought it was just the wind, but it's not, is it?" I shook my head, grabbing the flashlight from beside me. "Stay here," I said, my voice shaking as much as my hands. I stepped away from the firelight, shining the beam of the flashlight into the trees. The light cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but empty woods. But the footsteps continued, growing closer, more insistent. My breath caught in my throat as I took a step back, suddenly feeling like prey. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice echoing through the quiet night. No response. Just more footsteps, moving faster now, circling me. I couldn't take it anymore. I ran back to the RV, grabbing Emma's hand and pulling her inside. We locked the door and turned off all the lights, sitting in the dark, listening. The footsteps stopped, but the silence that followed was worse. Then, just as I started to relax, there was a knock. A slow, deliberate knock on the door of the RV. We didn't move. We didn't breathe. Another knock. Louder this time. I reached for my phone to call for help, but there was no signal. We were on our own. The knocking stopped, replaced by that same shuffling noise from the night before. This time, it was right outside the window. I turned my head slowly, my heart pounding in my ears, and there, standing just outside the glass, was a figure. A shadowy shape, too distorted to make out any features, but its eyes... I swear its eyes were glowing in the dark, staring right at me. I blinked, and it was gone. We didn't sleep that night. By morning, the figure, whatever it was, had disappeared. We packed up as quickly as we could and left the campground without looking back. Mr. Whiskers never came back. We never found him. And as for that night, I still don't know what we saw. Maybe it was just the stress, or maybe it was something else. Something I don't want to think about. But every now and then, when the house is quiet and the wind is howling outside, I hear it again. That faint, shuffling noise, and I wonder if it followed us home. If you thought you were safe, think again. The next story will prove you wrong. I've always loved camping. There's something about being out in nature, away from the buzz of everyday life, that makes me feel calm and free. No city noise, no schedules, no work stress. Just the quiet sounds of the forest and the gentle lap of the lake against the shore. That's exactly why my friends and I decided to take a weekend trip out to Woodridge Lake. It was supposed to be a simple getaway, just me, Jake, Sarah, and Emily. We weren't expert campers by any stretch, but we had been out enough times to know the basics. The campsite we picked was perfect, right by the lake, surrounded by trees, with just enough space to pitch our tents. The weather was ideal too, warm enough during the day to swim and cool enough at night to make a campfire feel cozy. We set up our tents, cracked open some drinks, and started unwinding as the sun began to set. That first night was quiet. The only sounds were the occasional crackle of the fire and our laughter as we swapped stories and roasted marshmallows. We didn't notice anything strange until Jake pointed it out. "Hey, do you guys see that?" he asked, squinting across the lake. I turned to where he was looking. Across the water, in the distance, there was a light, a faint, flickering glow. At first I thought it might be someone else camping on the other side, but the way the light moved was odd. It wasn't steady like a campfire or flashlight. It flickered in bursts, almost like Morse code, blinking on and off at irregular intervals. Then it disappeared. "That's weird," Sarah said, her voice low. "Maybe it's just someone with a lantern?" "Could be," I agreed. "But why turn it on and off like that?" We didn't think much of it after that. There were always odd things in the woods, animals, other campers, or just tricks of the light. So we shrugged it off and went back to our conversations. The night passed without incident, and by morning, the strange light was forgotten. But the next night, it happened again. This time, the light was brighter, and it lasted longer. It flickered in that same strange pattern, on, off, on again, then gone. The four of us watched it for a while, trying to figure out what it could be. Emily, ever the practical one, suggested it might be some kind of signal. "Maybe someone's lost, or they're trying to communicate with us," she said. "Or maybe it's aliens," Jake joked, but there was an edge to his voice that didn't sound so sure. We spent the rest of that night talking about what the light could be. Sarah thought it was probably just a fisherman out late, using a lantern to attract fish. Emily leaned towards the idea of it being some kind of scientific experiment or even a drone. I wasn't sure what to think, but I had to admit it gave me an uneasy feeling. Something about it just didn't sit right. On the third night, the light appeared again. But this time, it wasn't alone. We had just settled around the campfire when Jake pointed it out. There it is again. We all turned to look. Sure enough, the light was there, flickering across the lake. But this time, there was another light, closer to the shore, and it was moving toward us. It wasn't as bright as the first, but it was definitely there, and it was getting closer. "That's not someone camping," Sarah whispered, her voice tense. "It's moving too fast." We all watched in silence as the light continued its approach. My heart started pounding in my chest, and I could feel the tension between us rise. No one said anything, but I could tell we were all thinking the same thing. Something wasn't right. Suddenly, the light stopped. It hovered there, just above the water, as if it was watching us. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, it blinked out. For a moment, no one spoke. The fire crackled, and the air felt thick with unease. "We have to check it out," Jake finally said, breaking the silence. "What? Are you crazy?" Sarah replied, her voice rising with fear. Come on, don't you want to know what it is? Jake insisted. We'll just paddle over and take a quick look. If it's nothing, we'll come right back. I wasn't so sure, but the curiosity was eating at me too. After a few minutes of debate, we decided to go for it. Jake and I grabbed one of the canoes, and after a lot of convincing, Sarah and Emily reluctantly agreed to come along. We pushed off from the shore, the canoe gliding silently across the dark water. The lake was eerily still, the only sound the soft splash of our paddles. As we got closer to where we had seen the light, I felt a growing sense of dread, but I couldn't back out now. Then, just as we were about to reach the spot, the light appeared again, this time right in front of us. It was brighter than before, and it hovered just above the water's surface. For a second, we froze, staring at it in disbelief. Then the light moved, slowly, deliberately, toward the shoreline. We followed. As we neared the shore, we saw something that made all of us stop. Sitting on the edge of the lake was an old man, hunched over in a small fishing boat, holding a lantern. He looked up at us, his weathered face lit by the soft glow of the light. "Evening," he said, his voice raspy but friendly. "Didn't mean to scare you kids." We just stared at him, still trying to process what we were seeing. The old man chuckled and gestured toward the lantern. "Been using these old things for years," he said. "Helps me guide the fish to my nets. Guess I didn't realize I was causing such a fuss." Jake laughed nervously, the tension breaking a little. "We thought you were, I don't know, something else." The old man smiled, his eyes twinkling in the lantern light. "Folks around here have all kinds of stories about these lights. Aliens, ghosts, government experiments. But nope, just me and my lanterns." We spent the rest of the night sitting with the old man, swapping stories and laughing at how spooked we had been. He even taught us a thing or two about fishing, and by the time the sun started to rise, all the tension from the past few days had melted away. But as we paddled back to our campsite, I couldn't shake the feeling that something still wasn't right. The old man's explanation made sense, but what about the other light, the one that moved toward us on its own? None of us mentioned it, but I knew we had all seen it. To this day, I still wonder about those lights. Maybe it was just an old man fishing, or maybe it was something else entirely, something we'll never really understand. And that's the part that still keeps me up at night. If that made your heart race, the next one will stop it cold. I was never much of an outdoor person, but when my wife, Melissa, suggested we take the kids on a camping trip in our newly rented RV, it sounded like a decent idea. Our twins, Jake and Lily, had been pestering us for an adventure, and honestly, with work being so hectic, I thought the peace and quiet would be good for all of us. You know, unplug from the world for a weekend and just be together. So, one Friday afternoon, we packed up everything we thought we'd need. Snacks, blankets, flashlights, the whole deal, and hit the road. Melissa had planned a route through some scenic, rural area with a perfect campsite by a river. The drive was fine, the kids were excited, and we were looking forward to a couple of days away from our phones and responsibilities. But life, as it turns out, had other plans. About 2 hours in, the RV started making this weird noise, like a rattling that came from underneath. I wasn't too concerned at first. I figured it was just the engine settling in. But the sound got worse, louder, and soon enough, the whole vehicle lurched to a stop in the middle of nowhere. No signal on my phone. No cars for miles. Just us, stranded on a dusty road with nothing around but dry fields and a few scraggly trees. Melissa stayed calm, which helped me stay calm. She always had that effect on me. We figured the best thing to do was to wait for a tow truck. But with no signal, we had no way of calling one. "We'll camp out here for the night," I suggested. "Tow trucks can wait until the morning." The kids were thrilled. They thought it was all part of the adventure. So we set up our makeshift camp. I got a small fire going with what little wood we could find, and we roasted marshmallows as the sun dipped below the horizon. For a while, it was actually nice. Stars overhead, the warmth of the fire, the kids laughing. It almost made me forget about our little predicament. That was until Jake spotted something off in the distance. "Dad, what's that over there?" he asked, pointing. I squinted into the darkness and saw what looked like the silhouette of an old farmhouse, barely visible under the light of the moon. It was probably about a 5-minute walk away. The kids, of course, were immediately intrigued. They wanted to check it out. Melissa and I exchanged a look, both thinking the same thing. A rundown farmhouse in the middle of nowhere? Yeah, that sounded like the start of every horror movie ever. But Jake and Lily begged and pleaded, so finally, we gave in. "All right," I said, grabbing a flashlight. "We'll check it out. But just for a few minutes, and we're staying together." The walkover was eerie. The wind was starting to pick up, making the dry grass rustle around us. The closer we got, the more unsettling the farmhouse became. It was old, real old. The windows were shattered, and the wood was worn and splintered. A single wooden door hung slightly ajar, creaking as it swayed in the breeze. Melissa laughed nervously. "Well, this is charming. Looks like a hideout for outlaws," I joked, trying to lighten the mood. The kids giggled, but I could tell they were a little spooked too. We didn't go inside. The place looked like it could collapse at any second. Instead, we stood outside, peering through the broken windows and making up wild stories about what might have happened there. Maybe it was abandoned after a fire, or perhaps it was once the home of an old hermit who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. But then we heard it, a rustling from inside the house. We all froze. My first instinct was to tell myself it was just the wind. But this sounded different, more deliberate, like someone, or something, was moving around in there. Jake grabbed my arm. "Dad, did you hear that?" Before I could answer, there was a loud creak from the porch. I whipped the flashlight toward the sound, and there, standing at the front of the house, was a man. He was wearing a sheriff's uniform, his face shadowed by the brim of his hat. "Evening," he said, his voice low and gravelly. I didn't know whether to be relieved or more scared. Hi," I stammered. "We didn't mean to trespass. Our RV broke down a little ways up the road, and we were just checking this place out. Didn't think anyone lived here." The sheriff stepped forward, his boots crunching on the dry ground. His expression was unreadable. "This here's private property," he said, his eyes narrowing. "You shouldn't be poking around." I opened my mouth to explain, but before I could say anything, he reached for his belt, and my heart nearly stopped when I saw the glint of metal, a gun. Melissa stepped in front of the kids, her face pale. "Whoa, hey, we didn't mean any harm," I said, raising my hands. "We'll leave right now." For a few tense moments, the sheriff just stared at us, and I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. But then, to my surprise, he started to laugh, a low, rumbling laugh that seemed to echo in the stillness around us. "I'm just messing with you folks," he said, shaking his head. "Ain't nobody lived in that farmhouse for years. Just making sure you weren't up to no good." I forced a laugh, but something about the whole situation still felt off. The sheriff stepped closer, his face now fully visible in the beam of my flashlight. He was older, maybe in his late 60s, with a weathered face and sharp eyes that seemed to gleam in the darkness. "Tell you what," he said, "I'll help you folks get your RV up and running. Don't want you stranded out here all night." Reluctantly, we agreed, and he followed us back to the RV. True to his word, the sheriff seemed to know what he was doing. After tinkering with the engine for a while, he managed to get it started again. We thanked him, and for a moment, it seemed like the strange encounter was over. But as we sat around the fire later that night, something kept gnawing at me. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something off about that sheriff. "Do you think he was really a sheriff?" Melissa asked quietly, echoing my own thoughts. "I don't know," I admitted, "but we should probably leave first thing in the morning." That night, I barely slept. Every little noise made me jump. The wind, the creak of the RV, the rustling of the trees. And in the early hours of the morning, just as I was drifting off, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A knock on the door. I held my breath, my heart racing, but I didn't move. For what felt like an eternity, I waited, listening. There was nothing but silence. When I finally mustered the courage to look outside, there was no one there. But in the dirt, just outside the RV, I could see fresh boot prints, leading back toward the farmhouse. We left as soon as the sun came up, and I haven't been able to stop thinking about that night since. I don't know who or what that sheriff was, but something about him didn't feel right. And sometimes, late at night, I still hear that knock. You think that was the worst? Oh, just wait for what comes next. It started out like any other trip. just a couple of friends and an RV, ready for an adventure in the middle of nature. There were 5 of us: me, Jenny, Marcus, Lila, and Chris. We'd been talking for months about visiting the rainforest near the coast. It's known for its incredible waterfalls and hiking trails, the perfect mix of thrill and beauty. None of us had ever been out that way before, so we figured it would be something new, something exciting. We packed up the RV with everything we'd need for a weekend away: snacks, drinks, a few changes of clothes, and our hiking gear. The plan was simple. We'd park near one of the trailheads, set up camp, and then spend a day or two exploring. There was one waterfall in particular that we all wanted to see, called Crystal Falls. It was supposed to be massive, the kind of thing you only see in postcards or travel blogs. The drive out to the forest was beautiful. Tall trees lined the narrow road, their branches creating a canopy that made it feel like we were driving into another world. The deeper we got into the woods, the more the real world faded away. Cell service dropped out, and the only sounds were the hum of the RV engine and the occasional bird chirping somewhere far off. We reached the trailhead just before sunset. There were a few other cars in the lot, so we figured we wouldn't be the only ones exploring the area. That was kind of comforting in a way. Safety in numbers, I guess. We set up camp, started a small fire, and spent the evening talking about what we'd see the next day. The plan was to get up early, hit the trail, and make our way to Crystal Falls. We all crashed pretty early that night, excited for the adventure ahead. The next morning was perfect. The air was crisp, and there was this fresh smell that only comes from being surrounded by trees and nature. We grabbed our backpacks and hit the trail just after sunrise. The path was well marked at first, a simple dirt trail cutting through the forest. We could hear the distant sound of rushing water, which only fueled our excitement. About an hour into the hike, we came to a fork in the trail. There was a sign pointing left for Crystal Falls, but for some reason, Marcus suggested we check out the path to the right. It wasn't marked, but it looked like it had been used before, probably by locals or more adventurous hikers. He thought it might lead to some hidden spot, something off the beaten path that most tourists wouldn't know about. At first, we were hesitant. I mean, the whole point was to see Crystal Falls, but the idea of finding something new, something secret, was too tempting to resist. So, we followed Marcus down the unmarked trail. The deeper we went, the more overgrown the path became. Branches scraped our arms, and the thick canopy above made it feel like we were walking through a tunnel. It was eerie in a way, but none of us said anything. We were too caught up in the adventure of it all. After about another hour of walking, we started to realize we were lost. The trail had disappeared entirely, and there was no sign of any waterfall. Jenny suggested we turn back, but none of us could remember exactly how far we'd come or where we'd turned. It was all starting to blend together, and for the first time, I felt a knot of anxiety form in my stomach. But then, we heard it. A faint sound of rushing water, much closer this time. We followed the sound through the trees, pushing past thick vines and bushes, until we finally stumbled upon it. A hidden waterfall. It wasn't as big as Crystal Falls was supposed to be, but it was beautiful in its own way. The water cascaded down a series of rocks, falling into a small, clear pool below. The area around it was untouched, like no one had ever been there before. It felt magical, like we'd found something that belonged to us and us alone. For a while, we just stood there, staring in awe. Then Chris suggested we mark the spot so we'd remember how to find it again. He grabbed a few stones and stacked them into a small tower near the edge of the pool. It wasn't much, but it felt like we were claiming the spot as our own little secret. We spent the rest of the afternoon by the waterfall, swimming in the pool, and just soaking in the atmosphere. It felt like the adventure had been worth it, after all. As the sun started to dip lower in the sky, we decided it was time to head back. None of us really wanted to leave, but we knew we couldn't stay out there forever. We took one last look at the waterfall, our stone tower standing proudly by the water, and then started the trek back to camp. But something felt different on the way back. The forest seemed darker, the air heavier. It was as if the trees were closing in around us, making it harder to breathe. Every sound, every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig made us jump. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just the nerves from being lost earlier. But then I saw it, or I thought I did. A shadow. Just ahead of us, moving between the trees. I stopped in my tracks, my heart pounding in my chest. "Did you see that?" I asked the others, my voice barely above a whisper. But no one else had seen anything. They laughed it off, saying I was just spooked from the hike. Maybe they were right, but something felt wrong. As we kept walking, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, I thought I saw something, or someone, following us. Just out of sight, just out of reach. By the time we made it back to camp, it was almost dark. We hurried to light a fire, hoping the warmth and light would chase away the uneasy feeling that had settled over us. But even as we sat around the fire, laughing and trying to act normal, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. Something from the forest. From the waterfall. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard faint whispers, like the wind was carrying voices through the trees. And every time I opened my eyes, I saw that same shadow, just at the edge of the campfire's light, disappearing into the darkness before I could get a good look. We left the forest the next morning, eager to get back to civilization. But none of us talked about the strange feeling from the night before. We didn't talk about the shadow, the whispers, or the unease that clung to us like a second skin. I haven't been back to that forest since. None of us have. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear those whispers, and I still see that shadow, lurking just out of sight. We thought we'd found a secret, but maybe it was the other way around. Maybe the forest found us, and it hasn't let go.